The seal burned against Elias's palm before he even knew he was reaching for it. One moment he was walking through the ruins like he'd been told not to, and the next his hand was pressed against ancient stone that pulsed with a heat that felt alive, hungry, wrong. The marking appeared instantly, spreading across his skin like ink dropped in water, black lines that twisted and coiled up his arm, across his shoulder, stopping just short of his heart. And somewhere in a tower 3 kingdoms away, a king who hadn't looked at anything with real attention in 7 years suddenly turned his head and whispered a name he couldn't possibly know, Elias, as if he'd been waiting to say it his entire life. Elias was 26 years old and had spent most of those years perfecting the art of not being remembered. He worked in the kitchens of a monastery on the edge of the Vrelic wastes, a place where monks came to contemplate silence and visitors came to disappear. His job was simple: prepare meals, clean dishes, maintain the herbs in the garden, and above all, don't ask questions. The monks appreciated that about him. He'd arrived at their door 5 years ago with nothing but the clothes on his back and eyes that had seemed too much too young, and they'd taken him in without demanding his story. In exchange, he gave them labor and silence, 2 things the monastery valued above all else. The monastery itself was built on the ruins of something older, though no one seemed to know exactly what. Foundations that predated the current structure by centuries jutted from the earth like broken teeth. Stone walls that had once been part of some larger complex now served as garden borders or storage alcoves. And deep in the western section, past the vegetable gardens and the meditation courtyard, lay the sealed chamber, a section of the original structure that remained intact but locked, surrounded by warnings carved in languages most of the monks couldn't read. Don't enter. Don't touch. Don't look too long at the door. The seals on this place are old and angry, and some doors stay closed for reasons we've forgotten, but should still respect. Elias had walked past that chamber hundreds of times in 5 years and never felt anything. Just cold stone and the faint smell of earth that seeped from the cracks. The monks avoided it entirely, redirecting novices away from that section during their tours, never mentioning it in their histories of the monastery. It was functionally invisible, present but unacknowledged, like Elias himself, which was perhaps why, on a morning when the autumn sun cut through fog and shafts that looked almost holy, Elias found himself standing in front of the sealed door with a curiosity he couldn't name. He'd been harvesting the last of the sage before the first frost, his hands moving with the automatic precision of someone who'd done this task 1,000 times. The garden was peaceful, the only sound the distant chanting of monks at morning prayers. His mind was empty the way he preferred it, focused only on the immediate task, not thinking about the past he'd left behind or the future he couldn't imagine. But then he'd noticed something. A crack in the garden wall, one he'd never seen before, and behind it a passage, narrow, barely wide enough for a person to slip through, leading into the section of ruins the monastery had built around but never fully incorporated. He'd stood there for a long moment, sage stems forgotten in his hands, staring at that gap in the wall. Every instinct he'd developed in 5 years of making himself forgettable told him to turn away, to return to his work, to not see what he was seeing. But something else, something deeper and older and quieter than instinct, pulled him forward. The passage led through walls thick enough to muffle all sound, down stone steps worn smooth by feet that had walked them centuries ago, into a chamber that felt like it existed outside normal space. The air was different here, heavier, charged with something that made his skin prickle. The walls were covered in carvings, intricate patterns that hurt to look at directly, that seemed to shift when viewed from the corner of his eye. And in the center of the chamber, raised on a dais of black stone, stood a pillar, 7 feet tall, carved with symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness, and at its center, at exactly chest height for a man of average build, was a seal. A circular pattern of lines and curves and marks that pulsed with its own light, red like ember, like blood, like warning. Aelius should have turned back then, should have left the chamber and sealed the passage, and never spoken of what he'd seen. But he didn't. He walked forward, drawn by something he couldn't name and didn't want to examine. His footsteps echoed in the empty space, each one feeling more inevitable than the last. When he reached the pillar, he stopped and stared at the seal. Up close, it was beautiful in a terrible way. The marks formed patterns within patterns, each one seeming to mean something just beyond his comprehension. And at the very center, so small he almost missed it, was a handprint, human-sized, palm and 5 fingers, as if the seal had been designed to be touched, despite all the warnings, despite all the careful locks and barriers keeping people away from this place. He raised his hand, knew he shouldn't, did it anyway. The moment his palm made contact with the stone, the world exploded into pain and light and knowledge that burned as it entered his mind. The seal activated, releasing something that had been trapped for so long it had almost forgotten what freedom felt like. It poured into him through his hand, through his skin, spreading like fire through his veins. He tried to pull away, but couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stand there and receive what the seal was giving him. Images flooded his consciousness. A war that had ended centuries ago. A king who'd tried to stop it by binding something fundamental, something necessary, something that shouldn't have been chained. The cost of that binding, the curse that had been laid on anyone who broke it, and the reason the seal had waited all these years for exactly the right person to touch it. When Elias finally collapsed, when his hand fell away from the pillar and he crumpled to the cold stone floor, the seal was dark, empty, its purpose fulfilled, and his left arm, from palm to shoulder, was covered in black marks that moved slowly under his skin like living things trying to find comfortable positions in a new home. He woke in the infirmary, though he had no memory of how he'd gotten there. Brother Thoman, the monastery's healer, stood over him with an expression that was equal parts concern and something darker. Fear, maybe, or recognition. "How long have you been in the ruins, Elias?" The question was gentle but urgent. Elias tried to answer and found his throat too dry to speak. He raised his left hand to gesture for water and froze. The marks covered his entire arm now, black lines that formed patterns similar to what he'd seen on the seal. They didn't hurt exactly, but they felt wrong, present, aware, as if they were watching him from the inside. Brother Thoman followed his gaze, and his expression hardened. "Let me see." Elias extended his arm, and the monk examined the markings with careful hands that didn't quite touch them. After a long moment he stepped back and shook his head. "I need to consult the abbot. Don't leave this room. Don't let anyone else see those marks. And whatever you do, don't touch anyone." He left before Elias could ask why, his robes whispering against stone as he hurried away. Elias sat in the narrow bed and stared at his arm. The marks had stopped spreading, but they still moved subtly, shifting their patterns in ways that made him dizzy if he watched too long. He flexed his fingers experimentally. Everything worked normally, no loss of sensation or control. But there was something else, a presence at the edge of his consciousness, like a voice trying to speak but not quite managing words. And underneath that, a pull, a direction. As if his body now had a compass he hadn't asked for, pointing towards something he couldn't identify. The abbot arrived an hour later with Brother Thelman and 2 other senior monks. They stood at the foot of his bed like judges, their faces grave in the lamplight. The abbot was an old man, easily 70, with the kind of stillness that came from decades of meditation. But now that stillness was disturbed, ripples of concern breaking through his usual calm. "Show me your arm." Elias extended it again, and this time the abbot did touch the marks, his weathered fingers tracing the patterns with surprising gentleness. When he pulled away, his expression was unreadable. "Do you know what you've done?" Elias shook his head. The abbot sighed, a sound that carried the weight of knowledge he'd hoped never to use. "Those runes have been sealed for 300 years. Long before this monastery was built, before this order was established. We inherited them and the warnings that came with them. The seal you touched was placed there during the War of Binding, when the old kingdoms tried to chain forces they didn't understand. It was never meant to be broken." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The curse on that seal is specific. Whoever breaks it carries the mark, and whoever carries the mark draws the attention of the king who placed it. A king who has been waiting 300 years for someone to be fool enough or chosen enough to touch what should never be touched." Elias found his voice, though it came out rough. "What king? There haven't been kings in these territories for centuries." The abbot's expression grew darker. "Not a king of territories, a king of something older. Asterion the Unyielding, they called him. He ruled during the War of Binding, and he was the one who insisted the seals be placed. He believed some forces were too dangerous to use even against enemies, that binding them was the only way to prevent catastrophe, but the binding came with a cost. He had to tie himself to the seals, anchor them with his own life force. He's been alive for 300 years, sustained by the magic he used to lock away what others wanted to weaponize. And according to the old texts, he made a vow that if anyone ever broke one of his seals, he would hunt them down personally, not to punish them, but to understand why, to see if they were the one he'd been waiting for." The words hung in the air like smoke. Elias stared at his marked arm, at the patterns that seemed to spell out something he couldn't read. Why would a 300-year-old king be waiting for someone to break his seal? The abbot shook his head. "That's the question, isn't it? The texts aren't clear. Some say he sealed something of himself along with the dangerous forces, that he's incomplete without them. Others say he's looking for a successor, someone capable of understanding the choice he made and carrying its weight. And some say he's simply mad from 3 centuries of waiting, and that his attention is the last thing anyone should want." He paused, then added more quietly, "But there's one thing all the texts agree on. Once the mark appears, once you carry his seal, he can see you. No matter where you hide, no matter how invisible you make yourself, you've become visible to someone who hasn't looked away from his purpose in 300 years. That night Elias didn't sleep. He sat in the infirmary bed with his marked arm exposed to the moonlight streaming through the narrow window, and he felt it, the attention. Not physical, not immediate, but present in a way that made his skin crawl. Someone was looking at him. Someone far away but getting closer, their focus like a beam of light cutting through darkness, searching, finding, locking on. He'd spent 5 years making himself forgettable, and in one moment of curiosity, he'd made himself the most visible person in the world to someone who couldn't look away. The pull in his chest grew stronger. The compass that had appeared when he touched the seal now had a clear direction. North. 3 kingdoms away, Brother Thoman had said when Elias asked him to look at a map. There's a tower there on the border of what used to be Asterion's kingdom. The old texts say that's where he's waited all these years. That's where the heart of his binding is anchored. If he's still alive, that's where he'll be. The abbot came to see him at dawn. I can't keep you here. Not because you're unwelcome, but because keeping you puts everyone at risk. The mark you carry, it's not just a curse. It's a beacon. Every creature that was bound by Asterion's seals will sense you now. Will know that one of the chains has broken. They'll come looking, either to thank you or destroy you, depending on what they are and how they feel about their imprisonment. And Asterion himself, if he's truly still alive, will follow that beacon straight to you. I won't let this monastery become a battlefield. You have to leave. Elias had known this was coming, but the words still hit like a blow. He'd found safety here, something he thought he'd never find again after the life he'd fled from. And now he was losing it because he'd been curious about a door that should have stayed closed. Where should I go? The abbot handed him a pack, already prepared with supplies. Food, water, a cloak, a small amount of coin. North. Follow the pull you're feeling. Find this king if he exists. Understand what you've released and what it means for you to carry his mark. Maybe you'll find answers. Maybe you'll find only more questions. But staying here helps no one, least of all yourself. He paused, then added something that might have been kindness or might have been warning. The texts say that Asterion could see things others couldn't, that his purpose in the war wasn't power but protection. If he's been waiting for someone to break his seal, perhaps he's been waiting for someone worthy of understanding why he made it in the first place. Perhaps you're not cursed. Perhaps you're called. Elias left the monastery at midday, walking away from the only home he'd known in 5 years, with a pack on his back and marks on his arm that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. The pull north was undeniable now, a constant tug like a rope tied around his ribs. He tried to resist it once, turning east instead, but within an hour the discomfort was so intense he couldn't continue. His body wanted to go north, needed to go north. The seal had given him no choice. The landscape changed as he walked. The Vrelic wastes gave way to rocky highlands, then to forests of pine and birch where the air smelled of resin and earth. He avoided towns and villages, sleeping rough under trees or in abandoned shelters. The few times he did pass through settlements for supplies, he kept his left arm covered and his head down, trying to maintain the invisibility that had kept him safe for years. But it didn't work anymore. People looked at him now, not with recognition or interest, just a strange awareness, as if something about him caught the eye despite his attempts to blend in. The marks on his arm were hidden beneath his sleeve, but their presence leaked out somehow, making him noticeable in ways he couldn't control. And there were other things, creatures at the edge of his vision, watching from shadows or treetops. Once, camping by a stream, he woke to find a wolf sitting 10 feet away, its eyes reflecting his firelight. But it wasn't hunting him. It was staring at his left arm with an intensity that felt almost human. When he moved, the wolf tilted its head, then turned and disappeared into the forest without a sound. Another time, crossing a stone bridge over a gorge, he saw something in the water below. Not a fish, not anything natural. A shape that moved with purpose, surfacing briefly to look up at him before sinking back into the depths. These encounters should have terrified him. Instead, they felt like acknowledgments, as if the world itself was noticing that something had changed, that one of the old locks had been opened, and now everything was waiting to see what would happen next. The dreams started on the 5th night. He'd fall asleep and immediately find himself somewhere else. A tower room with windows that looked out onto a landscape he didn't recognize. Mountains to the west, a forest to the east, and between them a valley that had been scarred by something terrible. The room was austere, furnished only with a desk, a chair, and walls lined with books. And sitting at the desk, writing something in a journal, whose pages glowed faintly in the candlelight, was a man. He looked to be in his early 40s, though something about him suggested vast age hiding behind a relatively young face. Dark hair touched with gray at the temples. Sharp features that might have been handsome if they weren't so severe. Eyes that were the color of steel, focused on his writing with absolute concentration. He wore simple clothes, a shirt and trousers that had seen better days, and no crown or ornamentation to suggest royalty. But power radiated from him like heat from a forge. Not magical power, not exactly. Something else. Authority, purpose, the certainty of someone who'd made impossible choices and never regretted them. In the dream, Elias tried to speak but had no voice, tried to move but had no body. He was pure observation, watching this man write with steady hands. And then, without looking up, the man spoke. "I know you're there." The voice was quiet, but absolute, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to command attention. "I've felt you since the moment you touched my seal, since the moment you became visible." He set down his pen and finally looked up, not at Elias, but at something beyond him, through him. "I've been waiting for you for a very long time, longer than you can imagine. Walk north. Don't stop. Don't turn back. We have much to discuss, you and I." And then the dream ended, snapping off like a cut rope, and Elias woke gasping under a sky full of stars that seemed to watch him with the same intensity as the man in the tower. The pull north grew stronger after that, more insistent, almost painful, and the dreams continued every night. Sometimes he saw the man writing, sometimes pacing the tower room like a caged animal, sometimes standing at the window staring out at the scarred valley with an expression that might have been regret or might have been determination. But always, at some point, the man would acknowledge Elias's presence, would speak to him without looking directly at him, telling him to continue north, telling him not to fear what he'd find, telling him that the marks on his arm were not a curse, but a key, and that keys opened doors that changed everything. Elias wanted to hate this man. This king who'd placed seals that trapped people into cursed attention, who'd lived for 300 years sustained by magic that should have killed him, who now pulled Elias north like a fish on a line with no option to escape. But he couldn't quite manage hatred, because in those dreams he saw something else. Exhaustion, loneliness, the weight of centuries spent waiting for something that might never come. This wasn't a tyrant. This was a man who'd sacrificed everything for a purpose he still believed in, and that sacrifice had hollowed him out until almost nothing remained except the waiting. On the 12th day of walking, Elias crossed into the old kingdom of Asterion. The border wasn't marked, no signs or walls, but he felt it. The air changed, becoming charged with something he couldn't name. The light fell differently, sharper and colder, and the ruins increased. Everywhere he looked, evidence of the war of binding. Broken fortresses overgrown with vines. Craters in the earth where battles had been fought with forces that left permanent scars. Fields that still wouldn't grow crops 300 years later because something fundamental in the soil had been damaged. This had been a prosperous land once. Now it was a graveyard, beautiful in its desolation, haunted by ghosts that might or might not be metaphorical. He met another traveler on a road that wound through those ruins. A woman, older than him by perhaps 10 years, with the kind of weathered face that came from a life spent outdoors. She carried a staff and a pack similar to his, and when their paths crossed at a crossroads, she stopped and stared at him with eyes that saw too much. "You're marked." It wasn't a question. Elias instinctively moved his left arm behind his back, but she shook her head. "I can see it through your sleeve, through your skin. You carry one of his seals." She said his with no need to clarify who she meant. Everyone in these territories knew who his referred to. Elias didn't know what to say. The woman studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "I'm Vara. I've been studying the War of Binding for 20 years, collecting stories, trying to understand what really happened. And in all that time I've never met someone who actually carried a mark." She gestured to his arm. "May I see it?" He hesitated, but something in her face suggested genuine curiosity rather than threat. He pushed up his sleeve, revealing the black patterns that still moved subtly under his skin. Avara leaned close, not touching, just looking. Then she stepped back and laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "He's actually calling someone. After 300 years. Do you have any idea what this means?" Elias shook his head. She ran a hand through her gray-streaked hair. "It means the waiting is over. Whatever he sealed, whatever he's been guarding all this time, he thinks the moment has come to address it. And he's chosen you as the one to help him do it, or to stop him, or to understand him. The old texts are frustratingly vague about what he's actually waiting for." She paused. "Where are you headed?" He pointed north. She nodded as if she'd expected that answer. "The tower. Of course, I've been there once. Years ago. I made it to the outer walls before the wards turned me back. They're designed to keep everyone out, except the people he wants to let in. If you're carrying his mark, you'll pass through them like they don't exist." She looked at him with something that might have been pity. "I hope you're ready. Asterion isn't just a king. He's an idea that's been fermenting for 3 centuries. Meeting him will change you, probably in ways you can't predict." They parted ways after she gave him directions and warnings. "Don't trust your eyes when you get close to the tower. The wards mess with perception. make you see things that aren't there or miss things that are. Don't try to fight them. Just walk forward. And when you meet him, remember that he's not human anymore. Not really. 300 years of being tied to those seals have transformed him into something else. He might look human, but he's more like a force of nature now, elemental, absolute. Elias reached the tower on the 14th day. He crested a hill, and there it was, rising from the center of the scarred valley like a finger pointing at an indifferent sky. 7 stories tall, built from black stone that seemed to absorb light. No windows on the lower floors, only narrow slits near the top, surrounded by walls that had once been formidable but were now crumbling, breached in several places by time and weather. And around it all, barely visible to normal sight, the wards, shimmering barriers of force that bent reality, creating spaces that looped back on themselves or extended forever, or simply didn't exist in conventional terms. He descended into the valley following a road that had long since given up being a proper road, and was now just a suggestion of where travelers used to walk. The temperature dropped as he got closer to the tower, cold seeping up from the ground, like the earth itself was exhaling winter. His breath misted. Frost formed on the grass despite the autumn sun, and the pull in his chest became almost unbearable, a hook behind his sternum dragging him forward whether he wanted to go or not. When he reached the outer wall, he expected resistance, expected the wards to challenge him or test him or turn him away. Instead, they parted like water around a stone, creating a path directly to the tower's entrance. He walked through rooms of what had once been a courtyard, past a well that had run dry centuries ago, past the skeletons of buildings that had served purposes he could only guess at. And finally, he stood before the tower's door, massive, iron-bound oak. No handle, no lock, no visible way to open it. But as he approached, it swung inward silently, revealing a spiral staircase that climbed up into darkness. He entered. The door closed behind him without sound, without even a breath of air to mark its movement. He stood in absolute darkness for a moment, then lights began to appear. Not torches or lamps, but the walls themselves, glowing with faint blue-white luminescence that didn't seem to come from any source. The staircase spiraled upward, each step worn smooth in the center by feet that had walked them long ago. He began to climb. The tower was larger inside than outside, another impossibility he'd stopped questioning. He passed doorways that opened onto rooms that couldn't exist, hallways that led to places he couldn't see. But the staircase continued, and so did he, following the pull that was now so intense it felt like his heart was being drawn up through his chest. 7 flights, 7 floors, each one higher than the last, until he was climbing through space that should have extended above the tower's visible height. And finally, he reached the top. The door at the end of the staircase stood open. Beyond it, the room from his dreams. The desk, the chair, the walls of books. The windows looking out onto the scarred valley. And standing at one of those windows, backlit by the afternoon sun, was Asterion. He was exactly as he'd appeared in the dreams. Early 40s in appearance, dark hair graying at the temples, severe features that might have been handsome 300 years ago, before exhaustion carved lines around his eyes and mouth. He wore the same simple clothes, no crown or royal insignia. But his presence filled the room like a physical force, making the air heavier, making Elias's marked arm burn with recognition. When he spoke, his voice was the same quiet absolute Elias had heard in dreams. You came. No surprise in the statement, just acknowledgement. As if my arrival was inevitable, Elias thought. As if I never had a choice. I didn't think I had a choice, Elias said, his voice rough from 14 days of mostly not speaking. Astarion turned from the window, and Elias saw his eyes. Steel gray as he'd known they would be, but with something else. A depth that came from centuries of seeing too much. You had a choice, he said. You could have cut off your arm, removed the mark entirely. It's been done before. People who accidentally triggered one of my seals and chose mutilation over my attention. But you didn't. You came here instead. That tells me something about who you are. He moved away from the window, crossing the room with deliberate steps. Let me see the mark. Elias hesitated, then pushed up his sleeve. Astarion took his arm with surprising gentleness, turning it to examine the patterns in the fading light. His touch was cold, colder than human skin should be, but not painful. He traced one of the lines with a finger, and Elias felt something respond. The mark pulsed once, strongly, like a heartbeat. Astarion nodded, as if the mark had answered a question. Yes, you're the one. I wasn't certain until this moment, but now I am. You're the one I've been waiting for. To do what? Elias demanded, pulling his arm back. Why did you create seals that curse people? Why have you been waiting 300 years? What am I supposed to understand? Astarion returned to the window, looking out at the scarred valley. During the War of Binding, he began, his voice taking on the cadence of someone who'd told this story before, but never quite gotten it right. There were those who wanted to weaponize the old forces. The deep magics that exist beneath civilization, beneath human understanding. They thought these forces could be controlled, aimed, used to win the war. I disagreed. I'd seen what happened when people tried to bind powers they didn't comprehend. I'd seen entire cities erased because someone thought they could control something fundamental. So I made a different choice. I bound the forces myself, sealed them away where no one could reach them, and tied those seals to my own life. As long as I lived, they would hold. And I would live as long as the seals needed to be maintained. But why wait for someone to break them? Why not just keep them sealed forever? Because nothing lasts forever. Astarion turned back to face him. I've lived for 300 years, but I'm not immortal. Eventually, I'll die. And when I do, the seals will fail. All of them simultaneously. Everything I bound will be released at once, without control, without guidance. It will be catastrophic. So I built in a fail-safe, a way for someone to break one seal without releasing everything, to test whether the time has come to address what I locked away. And I tied myself to that breaking, made it so I would know instantly when it happened, and who did it. He paused. I'd been waiting for someone capable of touching the seal without being destroyed by it. Someone with the right combination of curiosity and caution, strength and vulnerability. Someone who could potentially understand what I've done and help me decide what comes next. Elias stared at him. You want me to help you decide whether to release the forces you've spent 300 years keeping locked away? Astarion smiled, a tired expression that held no joy. No, I want you to help me find a better solution. The forces I sealed weren't evil. They were necessary. They're part of the world's fundamental architecture, and binding them has created imbalances that grow worse every decade. The world is slowly dying from their absence, but releasing them without preparation would cause immediate catastrophe. I need someone who can help me find the middle path, someone who can see what I've become too isolated to see, someone who still lives in the real world and understands what it needs. And you think that's me? A kitchen worker who spent 5 years hiding from his own life? Asterion's expression shifted to something almost like recognition. I think you're someone who understands the cost of binding things that shouldn't be bound. Who knows what it's like to lock away parts of yourself for the sake of survival? Who's been invisible for so long that you've forgotten what it means to be seen? He gestured to the marked arm. That seal chose you. Not randomly. It responded to something in you, something that resonated with what I bound all those years ago. And now that you carry my mark, I can see you in ways I haven't seen anyone in centuries. I can see the fire you've been suppressing, the strength you've been hiding, the person you could be if you stopped running from yourself. The words hit harder than they should have. Elias looked down at his marked arm, at the patterns that had seemed like a curse, but now looked like something else. A map, maybe, or a key, as Asterion had said in the dreams. What happens if I refuse, if I just leave and never come back? Asterion walked to his desk and sat down, suddenly looking every one of his 300 years. Then I continue waiting. The seals continue holding. The world continues its slow decay. And you continue being invisible, suppressing your fire until it burns you out from the inside. We both lose. He looked up, and for the first time Elias saw genuine vulnerability in those steel-gray eyes. Or you can stay. Learn what I've learned. Understand what I've sealed and why. Help me find a way to address it that doesn't require me to live another 300 years or result in catastrophe when I finally die. It won't be easy. It might be impossible. But at least we'll try. At least we'll stop waiting and start acting. Elias stood in that tower room as the sun set beyond the windows, casting long shadows across the floor, and felt something shift inside him. The pull that had dragged him north for 14 days was still there, but it felt different now. Less like a hook and more like a thread, connecting him to this exhausted king and the burden he'd carried alone for so long. He thought about the monastery, about 5 years of perfect invisibility, about the life he'd built by making himself forgettable. And he thought about the moment he'd touched that seal, how some part of him had known it would change everything, and had done it anyway. Because maybe somewhere deep inside, he'd been tired of being invisible. Maybe he'd been waiting his whole life to be seen by someone who couldn't look away. "I'll stay," he said, "at least for now. At least until I understand what you're asking me to help with." Asterion nodded slowly, and something in his expression eased. Relief, maybe, or hope, though it looked strange on a face that had forgotten how to hold it. Good. Then we have much work to do. He stood and moved to one of the bookcases, pulling down a volume bound in cracked leather. We'll start with the history, with understanding what the old forces were, why they were dangerous, and why I believed binding them was the only option. Then we'll move to the consequences of that binding, the damage it's caused, the imbalances it's created. And finally, we'll begin exploring alternatives, ways to release what I bound in controlled measures. ways to restore balance without inviting disaster. The work began that night and continued for weeks. Asterion was a patient teacher, though patience that came from having 300 years to wait rather than natural temperament. He showed Elias the journals he'd kept, detailed records of every sealed force, every decision made, every consequence observed over centuries. He taught him to see the patterns in the mark on his arm, to understand that the symbols weren't random, but represented specific aspects of what had been bound. And he shared something else, his own story, not as a king, but as a man who'd made an impossible choice, and then had to live with it longer than any human should have to live with anything. "I had a family once," Asterion said one night as they sat in the tower room, with books spread across every surface. "A wife, children, people I loved more than my own life. I knew when I tied myself to the seals that I was condemning myself to outlive them, that I would watch them grow old and die while I remained, sustained by magic that wouldn't let me follow. But I did it anyway, because I believed the alternative was worse. I believed that if I didn't bind those forces, there would be no world for my children to grow old in." He stared at his hands, which were steady despite the pain in his voice. "They died 300 years ago. My wife, my children, their children, generations of descendants until the line ended completely. And I'm still here, still holding the seals, still waiting for the moment when I can finally let go." Elias listened and understood that this wasn't just about forces and bindings and magical architecture. It was about loneliness, about a man who'd sacrificed everything for a purpose he still believed in but was no longer sure was sustainable, about waiting so long for help that you'd almost forgotten what help looked like. The marked arm became a tool in their work. Elias learned to channel awareness through the patterns, to sense the places where the seals were weakest, where the bound forces pressed most strongly against their constraints. He learned to feel the imbalances in the world, the areas where absence of those forces created voids that distorted reality. And slowly, painfully, he began to understand the scope of what Asterion had done and why it couldn't continue indefinitely. One day, nearly 2 months after his arrival, Asterion took him to the valley. They left the tower and walked through the scarred landscape, and Asterion showed him what remained of the battlefield where he'd made his choice. This is where they wanted to release the deep forces as weapons, where they thought binding power to human will would give them victory. I stood here and saw what would happen if they succeeded, saw the cascade of destruction that would ripple outward, not just ending the war, but ending everything. So I acted first. I called the forces to me and bound them before anyone else could touch them. The cost was this." He gestured to the dead earth, to the crater that hadn't healed in 3 centuries. "Some bindings scar what they touch. Some wounds don't close. But the world survived. That has to count for something." They're returning to the tower, Elias feeling the weight of centuries pressing down on him, when they encountered the first challenge. Creatures appeared at the valley's edge, things that were neither animal nor spirit, but something between. Manifestations of the bound forces, drawn by the presence of someone who carried a mark. They didn't attack, just circled at a distance, watching with attention that felt almost intelligent. Asterion raised a hand and they retreated, but slowly, reluctantly. "They're getting stronger," he said quietly. "The seals are weakening. Not failing yet, but showing strain. I have decades left, maybe a century if I'm careful, but not forever. We need to find a solution before the choice is taken from us. The work intensified. Elias spent days in the tower's library, reading texts and languages he had to learn as he went, studying theories about fundamental forces and how they related to reality's structure. Asterion taught him techniques for manipulating the mark, for using it to test the seal's integrity without breaking them further, and together they began developing plans, not to release everything at once, but to create controlled releases, small openings that would let pressure escape without causing catastrophe. It was delicate work, requiring precision and understanding neither of them fully possessed yet. But it was possible. That was what mattered. It was possible. 3 months into his time at the tower, Elias received a visitor. Vara appeared at the outer wall, calling his name until he heard and came down to meet her. She looked older than when he'd seen her on the road, worn by travel and something else. Worry, maybe. "I've been tracking movements," she said without preamble. "Creatures appearing where they shouldn't. Reality bending in places that used to be stable. Whatever you and Asterion are doing up there, it's having effects. People are noticing. Not many yet, not enough to cause panic, but it's starting." Elias brought her to the tower, breaking Asterion's solitude for the first time in decades. The king was wary at first, unused to strangers in his space. But Vara had knowledge they needed, practical information about how the world had changed since Asterion locked himself away. She stayed for a week, sharing what she'd learned about the war's aftermath, about how people had adapted to living in a world where certain forces were absent. And she asked questions that neither of them had thought to ask. What happens to the people living near the seals when you start releasing them? Have you considered that 300 years of absence means no one alive has experience with these forces? That you're essentially introducing something new to a world that's forgotten how to handle it? Her questions forced them to expand their planning, to consider factors beyond just the technical aspects of breaking bindings. They needed to prepare people, to educate communities living near the seal sites about what was coming, to create support systems for handling the disruptions that would inevitably occur. The work grew larger, more complex, involving more than just 2 people in a tower. It required building a network, recruiting others who understood what was at stake and were willing to help manage the transition. Elias found himself becoming visible in ways he'd never been before. Vara introduced him to other researchers, scholars who'd studied the war and its consequences. Some were skeptical, unwilling to believe that Asterion was real or that his seals could be safely addressed. Others were eager to help, seeing an opportunity to heal wounds the world had carried for centuries. Slowly, carefully, a team formed. People with different skills, different perspectives, all working toward the same goal. Finding a way to release what had been bound without destroying everything in the process. Asterion struggled with this. 300 years of working alone had made him distrustful, unused to collaboration. But Elias pushed him, insisted that this couldn't be solved by isolation, that the problems Asterion had created required collective effort to fix. And gradually the king learned to listen to voices other than his own, to consider approaches he wouldn't have thought of, to trust that others could carry part of the burden he'd borne alone for so long. 6 months after touching the seal, Elias stood in the tower room and realized he'd changed. The man who'd entered this place had been running from himself, hiding behind invisibility, convinced that being forgotten was the same as being safe. But the mark had made him visible, and visibility had forced him to become someone capable of being seen. He'd learned skills he never knew he needed. He'd connected with people in ways he'd thought he'd lost the capacity for. He'd found purpose in helping solve a problem that existed on a scale he could barely comprehend. The fire inside him, the one he'd spent years suppressing, now burned openly, not consuming him, but guiding him, giving him strength he hadn't known he possessed. And Astarion had changed, too. The exhausted, isolated king, who'd existed in the tower like a ghost for centuries, had begun to remember what it meant to be human, to work with others, to hope for solutions rather than just holding the line. The relationship between them had evolved from teacher and student to something more like partners. Two people who'd been invisible in different ways, now seeing each other clearly and choosing to face an impossible task together. The first controlled release happened on a winter morning when the valley was buried under snow. They'd chosen one of the smaller seals, a binding that held a force related to growth and decay, necessary for natural cycles but dangerous if unleashed without control. The team was in place, researchers and scholars stationed at observation points, ready to measure effects and intervene if necessary. Astarion stood at the center of a ritual circle he'd drawn in the tower room, his hands moving through gestures he'd practiced for months. And Elias, marked arm extended, channeled awareness through the patterns to the seal they'd chosen, feeling for the precise moment when controlled release could begin. It took hours. The seal resisted, not wanting to open even partially. But gradually, with patience and precision, they coaxed it. A crack formed, impossibly small, letting through a trickle of the bound force. Elias felt it pass through his mark, felt the way it wanted to explode into the world after 3 centuries of constraint. But they held it, guided it, directed it to places where its absence had created voids. The valley responded immediately. The dead earth that hadn't grown anything in 300 years suddenly sprouted green shoots, grass pushing through snow that should have prevented growth. Trees that had been dead husks showed signs of life, sap beginning to flow in trunks that had been dry as bone. It was working. The release was controlled, beneficial, healing, rather than destroying. But it was also exhausting. Maintaining the control required constant attention, constant adjustment. Astarion aged visibly during the process, his face growing more lined, his hands developing a tremor that hadn't been there before. When they finally sealed the crack again, smaller than before, but not closed completely, he collapsed. Elias caught him before he could fall, feeling how cold the king's skin had become. "How much did that cost you?" The answer was in Astarion's eyes. "More than I have to give many more times." They'd proven it was possible, but they'd also proven that the cost might be too high to repeat indefinitely. Over the following weeks, they refined the process, found ways to distribute the strain among multiple people rather than having Astarion bear it all. The marked arm became crucial in this, allowing Elias to act as a conduit, channeling some of the force's pressure away from the king. Other marked individuals were identified, people who'd accidentally touched lesser seals over the years and survived. They were brought to the tower, taught to use their marks, integrated into the team. Each release became slightly easier, slightly safer, though never without risk and never without cost. A year after touching the seal, Elias stood at the tower window, looking out at the valley, and saw that it was transforming. Still scarred, still marked by what had happened centuries ago, but alive now in ways it hadn't been. The controlled releases were working, slowly restoring balance, letting the bound forces reintegrate with the world in measured amounts. It would take decades, maybe centuries, to complete the process, but it was happening. The work Asterion had begun alone and thought he'd die maintaining now had a path forward that didn't require eternal vigilance from a single impossibly old king. Asterion joined him at the window, moving more slowly than he had a year ago, but with less of the exhaustion that had defined him before. "You did this," he said quietly. "Not alone, but you started it. You touched that seal when no one else would have. You came here when you could have run. You stayed when you could have left. You made yourself visible when you'd spent years perfecting invisibility, and because of that, we have a chance. Not a guarantee, but a chance. That's more than I've had in 300 years. Aelius looked at his marked arm, at the patterns that had stopped seeming like a curse months ago. I think the seal knew what it was doing when it chose me. Or you knew when you created it. You weren't waiting for someone strong or wise or naturally suited for this work. You were waiting for someone desperate enough to touch something they shouldn't. Someone invisible enough to understand what it means to be seen. Someone who carried their own bindings and their own suppressed fire. Someone who could understand what you'd sacrificed because they'd been sacrificing themselves in different ways their entire life. Asterion smiled, a real smile this time, not the tired expressions Elias had seen before. Perhaps the seal simply recognized that you were ready to stop being invisible, and I was ready to stop being isolated, and it gave us both what we needed, a reason to be seen, a reason to connect, a reason to believe that impossible burdens don't have to be carried alone. They stood together at that window as the sun set over the valley. Two people who'd been invisible in different ways, now visible to each other and to the world. The work ahead was enormous, requiring dedication and collaboration and patience that would last generations. But it was possible. And possibility, after centuries of nothing but duty and waiting, felt like hope. Every hidden soul carries a fire that breaks rules, awakens kings, and bends destiny. If you've ever felt the pull of something you shouldn't touch, if you've ever broken a seal that was meant to stay locked, if you've ever made yourself visible to forces that couldn't look away, share your story in the comments below. Let this be a space where those who carry marks find others who understand. Remember to leave a like if this story reminded you that curses can become callings, that being seen can be terrifying and necessary, that the fires we suppress are often the ones the world needs most. And subscribe to walk this path with others who know that some doors are meant to be opened, even when every warning says they should stay closed. Until the next story, carry your marks with pride. Let yourself be seen. Remember that what calls you might be exactly what you're meant to answer.